Welcome to another episode of the Dakotans Election Central, where we are comprehensively covering the 2024 North Dakota election cycle. Today, I am joined by Brandon Prichard out of Bismarck District 8. He is running as an incumbent for the House of Representatives. Thank you for joining us today, Brandon.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be on your show. Thank you.
Absolutely. Before we get into the fun, the dirt, no, it's been an exciting year for politics. Let's just talk about Brandon for a minute. Tell us a little bit about your background. What inspired you to get into politics?
Certainly. I was born and raised in Bismarck. I've always been interested in politics. Was brought up in the grassroots of the Republican Party. I remember knocking doors for Kevin Kramer and for Kelly Armstrong back in 2018. I went off to school after I graduated high school. And I realized while I was in school that my state needs a lot of help. And I came back to North Dakota, ran for office. I saw that my district was a target for big money by the forces that may be. And so I threw my hat in the ring, and we were probably outspent 10-1, but we overcame that, myself and my two running mates, Jeff Magrum and Sue Ann Olson, back in 2022. And so I've served in the 68th legislative session in 2023, and we did some really outstanding work. But now I'm running for re-election, hoping to continue my work.
Absolutely, that's very exciting. Away from politics, you're a husband. What are you away? If I'm running to you on a Sunday afternoon in the middle of the summer, who's Brandon?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for mentioning that. My wife's gonna get mad that you mentioned instead of me, but we're going on a year now. In May, it'll be a year since my wife and I, Katie, got married. We're expecting our first sometime in late August, so we're really looking forward to that. I am a graduate of the University of Minnesota. I also was enrolled in law school and public policy coursework there for a good amount of time. And now I'm returned to North Dakota, and I'm the executive director of what is called Citizens Alliance of North Dakota, which keeps public officials accountable to their oath of office.
Very good. So you went to Minnesota for college. Was it always part of the plan to come back to North Dakota?
I've always thought that I'd be, around North Dakota, but it was probably around really COVID that I realized that, man, we need to make, especially, states like North Dakota that are supposedly conservative. We need to make sure that they are, really the strength of our nation. And there's a lot of states like Minnesota that I was, living in at the time that, they have so many young people and stuff, but it's just like the politics there are never going to change. But I realized in North Dakota, there's so much that we can do because the people are just outstanding, hardworking people. So I realized quite quickly during COVID that, my future has to be in North Dakota. So I returned to my home.
Absolutely. You've been the backer of some very strong bills. Some of them probably good for North Dakota. What are some of the key accomplishments or initiatives that you are most proud of from your time in office so far?
Well, yeah, I mean, and when I answer that question, usually I kind of break it up into the hot button issues and the issues that aren't touched as frequently. Myself, Bill Twite, and countless other lawmakers put forward a bill this last session, House Bill 1254, which banned mutilation of children. There's this movement that children can change their gender. In Minnesota, for example, just across state borders, it's viewed as a sanctuary state for what they call transgender care on minors, on children. So we banned that completely in North Dakota. It's now a Class B felony to do that kind of surgery on a child, and a Class A misdemeanor to prescribe medications with the intent to change a child's gender. So that was a huge accomplishment. But away from some of the social stuff, I was very active in the foster care and adoption realm. I passed two bills that actually merged into one later in the session that gives priority to foster families in the adoption process. The Health and Human Service Department is working through basically a redo of the entire foster care system. So the bill that I helped pass will be part of that new foster and adoption system. So that's really exciting. Worked on some campaign finance legislation that kind of unfortunately met an end at the way tail end of session. But I think next time around, we're going to have a really good shot at doing some campaign finance reform in North Dakota. So those are some big issues that I've kind of spearheaded in the 68th session.
Absolutely. And you bring up an interesting point that it's something that met an end in the last session, but you'll bring it up in the next. Something that recently got passed was term limits. And this is something that, not this election cycle, but in the next 4 years, we're going to really start feeling the effects of it as people are no longer able to run for election. You're one of those people, as you, weird deal due to redistricting and whatnot, served a 2-year term, even though you were elected to a 2-year term, and that's the weird part. And now you're going to serve a 4-year term if you're reelected, and then you won't be able to run again in the House due to term limits. First off, do you think this term limits, as it is right now, is good for North Dakota? And then I have a follow-up question about some of those bills that you're talking about that in the next session, you're going to be able to go, eventually there won't be that next session, and some of that continuity is going to be lost.
Yeah. Well, to answer your first question, I guess I'll say that from my perspective, and only I'll say from a self-interested perspective, I'm a little bit disappointed, but I always have so many things that I can be doing in my life, I suppose. I love politics, but I do hope to do other things. So, I guess it's a mandatory limit, and I'll do something else with my time, and that's okay. But speaking completely from a perspective of state governance, I think that the term limit should be something like 12 or 16 years or something. I think the point of term limits, and I'm not completely against term limits as a general rule, but I think what this term limit does, I think it cuts legislators too short. I think what probably it should have done is be a little bit longer, or allow, like what South Dakota does, where you can take some time off, and then later in your life or later in your career you can come back and serve in the chamber that you were in. I think that would be a little bit more effective of a term limit. If the point of the term limit is to, reduce the power of incumbency, which I think is a very, very valuable thing to do at some point, this term limit certainly does that, but it also takes away the necessary experience that I think that legislators are going to need. So it has its pros and cons. I think that in the short term, I think it's going to do some really good things for North Dakota. I think there's people that have served in the legislature for 30 years or whatever, and I appreciate their service, but it's like you can't just live in office in the same spot. I think that you should have a revolving door to some extent. Right. Now to your last question, there is so much that we're going to be able to do next session, and that's why I'm running for re-election. The 69th session is going to have a lot of big topics. I think we're going to talk about some of those. But I have some interests as well, like campaign finance, doing some additional things in the foster and adoption world as well. So,
well, let's go ahead and jump into it. What are some of your key things that you're wanting to have accomplished in this next session?
Well, the big thing I would say, we had a bill last session. Was brought forward by Representative Claire Corey of Grand Forks. It was an outstanding bill that would have started the process of school choice in North Dakota. And I'm not on the education committee, but I've always believed that a family should be able to decide if they send their children to private school, public school, or if they homeschool, and they should be able to pick which school they go to. So I'm going to do my best to make sure that I'm behind a real solid school choice bill in North Dakota that has long-term implications and is sustainable long-term. I think the bill from last session even didn't go far enough. It was more of subsidy giving directly to private schools. I think that what we should do is we should set up some kind of a account for parents, which they can then decide where they put their money. And it's going to take a lot of time and effort to really narrow in on what that would look like. But I know that states around the nation have done that. So that's a really big topic that the 69th session is going to have to delve into. Now, I think another thing that I would really like to do is the campaign finance reform side of things. The campaign finance side of North Dakota politics, I guess to put it bluntly, is a mess. Chapter 16.1, which is the part of the Century Code related to campaign finance, really has not been touched since the 1990s. And a lot has changed in North Dakota since the 1990s. And I remember speaking with Legislative Counsel early in the 68th session, over a year ago at this point. And I remember that there was a comment by one of the legislative attorneys they said this needs to be changed, and everybody in legislative council kind of agrees that it's a mess. Anybody that looks at it. It's basically like they've thrown on amendments since the 90s, and they just hope that it sticks. I know the Secretary of State has been doing his best to apply to or follow all the regulations and the parts of the code, and he does a good job, and his staff does a fantastic job. But it's very difficult to read those rules and think that they're transparent and that they're in the best interests of the people. People want transparency in politics, and we just don't have it. And we have unlimited rates of spending and donations. I think that big money in politics is one of the reasons that I got involved. But I think that we could change a lot just by looking at that code.
Absolutely. So first off, you mentioned school choice, and that's an interesting subject because something else that's top of mind for some voters due to some of the campaigns that are going on is ending property tax. And it seems like a school choice bill is going to tie into that somehow just because of how schools are funded. What do you think is the best way forward? If I guess we'll start here. Does property tax need reform in North Dakota?
Oh, completely. I think that anybody, the Democrats and the Republicans, would both agree that there needs to be significant property tax reform. It's just what that would look like.
Right. So then, digging down to the school choice bill, how does that affect the school choice? Where does if it's subsidized, however it works, where does that funding come from? In your view, with a tax bill reform?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think that our hands are kind of tied as lawmakers in terms of building the school choice bill until we know the result of this property tax measure that's on the ballot. And I have come out and said that I do support this property tax measure. I think that there are some things that are great and fantastic about it. I think that there's, a couple things that might be better if it was written maybe in a couple different ways. But that being said, as a lawmaker, we're going to have to see the outcome of that property tax measure to really understand how the school choice debate is going to shape next session in the 69th session. I think what would happen if it would pass, I'm not too sure that there would be the negative consequences that some people might think. I think that it becomes property tax would probably become maybe the third largest burden on the state at that point. Education and human services would still be more expensive in terms of our budget. So I would envision that third largest expense, which would be property tax, that would somehow be divided up into what you would call like a family savings account or a family account that parents could then spend. I'm not too worried about us figuring it out. I'm just more interested in kind of the chess that we're going to have to play to make it work.
Right. Makes sense. So I do something fun every once in a while in these interviews, and we got some more serious questions to work through, but do these rapid fire questions. And so what it is I'll ask you a question. You give one word answer. It might be a couple more words. You can explain your answer, but nothing to do with anything. No trick questions. Just having a good time to get to know Brandon better.
Okay.
You up for it?
I'll do it. Absolutely.
All right, here we go. What's your favorite North Dakota season?
Fall.
Fall. Favorite spot for outdoor adventures in North Dakota?
Right next to the Missouri River.
Okay. Favorite North Dakota holiday tradition?
Oh man, I'm gonna be lame just hanging out with my family at Christmas.
It's a good one. Top North Dakota destination for a weekend getaway?
Holy smokes. Sibley Lake, Dawson, North Dakota. It's America's country.
Here's the deal. You don't hear about this stuff until you get into the rapid fire questions, all right? You just don't know about it. If you could describe North Dakota in one word, what would it be?
Patriotic.
Favorite North Dakota town or city?
It's got to be Bismarck.
Best local event or festival in North Dakota?
Holy smokes. I love the Dickens Festival.
Oh, yes. That is a great time in Garrison. Best local dish or food in North Dakota?
It's got to be Nefla soup, man.
I'm glad you stayed away from the lutefisk. Favorite North Dakota historical figure?
Holy smokes. Probably, I don't even know what I would say to that. You might have to come back on that one. I'll have to think.
Yeah. Best thing about living in North Dakota?
I would say, man, the people are the best. That's why I ran for office.
Absolutely. It's a good time. Thank you for participating in that. I think it allows us to get to know our candidates just a little bit better. Um, so you mentioned with the property tax, this is basically a bipartisan deal. Both sides want to come together and get this done. How have you worked to build bipartisan relationships and find common ground on key issues? And North Dakota is unique because you have to build that across the party lines, but also you have to build that within the Republican Party because it's a very there's a lot of strong people in the Republican Party.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're exactly right. To be quite frank with you, I don't speak too often with my Democrat colleagues. I think that in the House, they're down to about 10% of the House chamber. I do every once in a while you have a vote where it's like, oh, there's a pretty big point of agreement there. I think one of the really unique times during session that I had a point of agreement with the Democrat was on the campaign finance side of things. I think that Democrats would also agree that there is a deep need for campaign finance reform. And I know that it wasn't actually my bill, but there was a campaign finance bill that was put forward by Mike Schatz, and it was co-sponsored by Carla Rose Hansen. And if you know those two people, that's the exact opposite ends of the spectrum. And I also voted for that bill. It was a bill that would expose some dark money in North Dakota. So it's really unique when you see something like that. Now, in terms of working with the Republican colleagues, I've kind of been known as somebody who calls out people a little bit, and maybe that's made me a little bit unpopular. But at the end of the day, I think that you need somebody in office that's willing to stand up and tell lawmakers when they messed up. Putting your head down and pretending like nothing happened when they vote against Republican principles, I think is a mistake. So I kind of have filled that void a little bit. But I've worked with colleagues in a lot of bills. So at the same time, I certainly have gotten a good number of things done with my colleagues, though I try to keep them accountable.
Right. So the two things you're bringing up is transparency and accountability. Um, and I think that's something that's very important to the North Dakota people. I think that there's something that is rising probably across the United States as a whole, but in North Dakota, that we want to know what's actually going on. Don't give us the political answer. What are you've mentioned that you have done it, but what are some ways that you try to make sure that there is transparency and there is accountability for the people?
Well, I have to look at it in a way of what ought to be done next session. I have always been supportive of legislation, for example, to tell the people of North Dakota directly where we're investing our legacy fund. And I think that stronger, harsher language that tells the people of North Dakota where our dollars are invested is very, very important. I want to know that if we're investing in foreign adversaries, that we get that money out, because investing by itself, for example, in companies that hate our coal and oil industry are bad enough. But then if we learn that we're investing in companies that are based in Russia or China, I think that's outrageous, and we need to divest as quickly as possible. So that's one way that I'm going to be very supportive of transparency to the public.
Yeah.
But yeah, go ahead.
What, I think first off, you mentioned legacy fund. I think that's an interesting topic because it seems like there's some polls that have come out. There's a really interesting, I think 65% of North Dakotans, in a poll I saw recently, 65% of North Dakotans say that they are a fan of legacy fund being used to be as an alternate financing for property tax. Do you feel like our legacy fund dollars, do you think it's being used properly in its current state?
I don't think so. I think that if you look at what there was a bill last session, I got to be careful. With respect, I know that our majority leader had put that bill forward. I was not the biggest fan of it, but it essentially builds a bunch of buckets for the legacy fund earnings and where we should spend that. It goes all over the place. In my opinion, I think that what we should do, and I have been at different times somewhat supportive of using legacy fund dollars for example, primary residence property tax exemptions. But I think that if I was what you would call in charge of or king of the legacy fund, I would decide that we should lock that thing up till 2040 or even longer. I think that the legacy fund could be used to fund the entirety of the government at certain points, 20, 30, 40 years down the line. And I think that we're making mistakes by spending those dividends on short-term gain when we could really have this thing as the first in the nation fund that funds the entirety of our government sometime down the line.
Yeah, that'd be incredible. It also brings back, in my mind, it brings us back to term limits a little bit, because that's a visionary thought to go and lock something up. And at that point, 2030, 2040 for sure, even if you ran on the Senate side, you would not be in the legislature anymore. You'd be done if you ran on the Senate side immediately after the House side. I know that's a lot of what ifs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Point is, this is something that doesn't affect you, doesn't necessarily even make someone want to vote for you again because it's so far down the road. Do you
Right.
think visionary thoughts like that will die as term limits goes in and people are just, we have 8 years, let's get stuff done now?
Well, I think that I don't think that they will die. I think that there might be more of a focus on some short-term game versus the long-term game. But look, I mean, you get a lot of people who are interested in different things, and if the legacy fund certainly is one of those things where a lot of incoming lawmakers last session were always talking about what are we going to do, or where we're going to put our legacy fund money. It's a giant a giant pot of money. So I think that debates on those things will exist for a long time. You might be correct that some of those topics might not be as popular, but I don't know. I guess I don't know what the public opinion would be on that. Now, I can tell you in my personal life, I guess I have to some extent tried to overcome that power that I might not be able to hold if I'm not in elected office. Using Citizens Alliance of North Dakota, which is the organization that I have used to put forward my vision of North Dakota and calling lawmakers and holding them accountable. I think that there might be a push for some of these very active lawmakers in North Dakota to shift towards nonprofit organizations or lobbyist positions to essentially see through their vision of North Dakota. And I know that I'm doing that, and I would be very surprised to see if some of these very active lawmakers in North Dakota wouldn't do the same thing to make sure that in 2040, 2050, or however long they want to be involved in politics, that their vision comes to fruition.
Absolutely. That brings us to a great question, a segue to a great question. What do you see as the biggest challenges facing North Dakota in the next few years, not maybe as an imminent?
Well, certainly, to be quite honest, I think that what North Dakota, there's two answers to this. There's the North Dakota specific, and I think that there's the specific problems that are more nationalized. I'll start with the national issues first. I think that our border, and of course we have the border to our north as well, but the border is a very serious problem that we're going to have to fix. I know that that having illegal immigrants in North Dakota, that having a large new population in North Dakota. Look, I'm all for people coming to North Dakota that want to work and live here and start families here, but we're having every day we're having drug addiction overdoses, and we're having very serious problems that North Dakota needs to tackle. And I think that we need to be harder on crime, to be quite honest with you. I think that we need to increase crimes on things like fentanyl and other drugs, especially if you're selling those types of drugs. I mean, I heard in Bismarck just recently that there was a guy from Detroit that came here to sell drugs. I heard of a 2-year-old that died of an overdose from fentanyl. I mean, it's becoming very serious, and heck, North Dakota isn't even the worst example. States, that surround us are way worse than we are, but that will be a long-term issue. Workforce will be a long-term issue that we're going to have to tackle in North Dakota. But staying on the federal side just for 1 second, I think that's something that people don't realize is such a big issue. We always talk about spending. We had a $19.6 billion budget in the 23-25 session. The probably over half of that portion comes from federal aid or federal, Medicaid, Medicare, whatever. And a lot of that money is, we're going to have to keep that money. We're going to have to make sure that continues to come in. But the problem with federal aid, the problem with, federal matches, whatever you want to call it, is that, they control some of our policy that we make in North Dakota. I mean, if essentially I'll claim it as this: the strings attached are brutal for North Dakota. I served on the Human Services Committee, and the number of conversations that we had to have in the Human Service Committee over passing, for example, a bill to protect healthcare workers from being forced to get vaccines or face mask mandates or whatever, is that we're going to lose federal funding if we even talk about this thing. I mean, if we pass this thing, it's a no-go for federal aid. North Dakota is in a unique position with the money that we have coming through, with oil, natural gas, all that stuff. So it would be completely crazy if we did not start thinking about ways to make sure that we are reliant on nobody but ourselves. So that's a major issue. The last thing that I'll say on the specific issues in North Dakota is the property tax debate. If you ask, I'll say this: I go out and I talk to voters frequently. Pretty much every week, I'll go out and talk to voters. I'll go door knock in my district and talk with them. The number one issue that everybody says is property tax, and it's not even close. I mean, yes, they'll talk about the national and social issues, but property tax is far and beyond the topic that people discuss. If we're going to help the North Dakotan, if we're going to help the North Dakota people in any way, it's going to be through a long-term property tax bill that's going to be sustainable, not through these $500, short-term relief bills. It's just not going to cut it. We need something, especially primary residents, to either be exempt, to be significantly cut. If this property tax bill goes through, that'll solve it. I guess I should say solve it, but there's going to be a lot of work that has to be done on our side. But we really need to tackle property tax in North Dakota.
Do you think that that's an issue that should be solved through the constitutional amendment process, the initiated measure, or through the legislature?
Well, I think that it should be solved through the legislature, but I don't blame, for example, Becker and the supporters of the property tax measure that are doing this. And the reason is because for so long, I mean, a decade ago, we had one on the measure. We had a bill on the ballot, or rather, a measure on the ballot that would have, changed property tax in North Dakota significantly. It was shot down. But lawmakers at that point said, what we're going to do is we're going to go back to work, and we're going to have, real long-term relief for property tax. And really all they've done is do buy downs. And I guess applaud them for doing what they have. But at the same time, it's not even close to enough. And people just do not feel the relief at all in North Dakota. So I don't blame the sponsors of this, petition for putting it up as a constitutional amendment. It just doesn't seem that the legislature has the appetite of doing something more significant.
Jumping to a social issue, recently it was reported that the Tennessee governor signed legislation that states people should not be required to solemnize a marriage if they refuse to do so based on their conscience or religious beliefs. Do you think having similar legislation protecting public officials and even protecting pastors would be a good thing for North Dakota?
Well, and what did that bill do? I'm sorry, maybe I'm not familiar with the bill. It did what now?
Yeah, it was recently passed or recently signed in Tennessee, where it just protected public officials from having to perform marriages for anybody that they wanted, anybody that wanted to get married.
Well, that would make sense. I mean, that's right in line with our First Amendment rights and a church's First Amendment right to decide, who is allowed to have a ceremony in their church. I think that would be a no-brainer here in North Dakota to have something like that to protect the religious liberties of pastors or priests and churches.
Yeah, and I guess following that up, do you feel like it's necessary? Do you think North Dakota is just kind of immune to? Sometimes there's this impression that's given that some of these major social issues that are overtaking the country that a lot of states are involved in, North Dakota is just immune from it. We don't have to deal with it. Do you feel like that's the case, or do you think there should be measures taken to protect?
No, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think that there needs to be measures that protect here in North Dakota. I think that the idea that we're immune from any of this stuff is just like with the argument with fentanyl and illegal immigrants. I mean, it's like we need to be proactive, even if it's not as bad here in North Dakota as it is in other states. Does not mean that we cannot be proactive. I kind of look at North Dakota as maybe a couple years behind what some of these other states like California and the East Coast has for their problems in terms of the social issues. But eventually it'll come knocking on our door too. And we just have an opportunity, I think, to essentially look in the future and see what's coming to North Dakota if we don't, act quickly. So, yeah, I mean, guaranteeing religious liberties, for example, is kind of a no-brainer.
You mentioned that you are a Christian first, conservative second, Republican third. How important do you feel it is to have godly influence in decision making?
Well, you can't separate it. I think that this idea that separation of church and state. I mean, there's a valuable conversation on what that looks like, but you can't have a political setting without God. I mean, it's impossible, and if you try to do it, you'll become disordered very quickly. So having a deep faith in the eternal, having a faith in God and Christ, I think is a necessary part of government. If you're going to be elected, especially with the culture that we have here in North Dakota, you need to have a strong faith. So that's why I say that faith and family are far before my political identity. I have, a very soft spot in my heart for the Republican Party, but I mean, I would leave it any day if that meant that I had to follow my God and my family.
Right. I think the most interesting thing in that statement, what stood out to me, was you're a conservative before you're a Republican.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really, I guess, first off, what do you mean by that today?
Well, first of all, I think that our party platform in North Dakota is exceptionally strong. I think that it embodies conservatism very well by putting forward family values. It puts forward, for example, making sure that our budget is in line, making sure that our civil liberties are protected. All those things talk about or tend towards a conservative culture, something that is worth preserving for the long term, and something that has stood the test of time, that being the family, civil liberties, and just good governance, for example, with property rights. And if we ever back away from that as a political party, I think that I could not identify with that party, but I would always still identify with holding those eternal principles and good governance, close to my heart.
Yeah, principles before being part of a group or anything like that. If reelected, we've already kind of talked about this, but I just want to hear your number one thing. What is the number one thing you hope to achieve in another term in office?
I hope that, I would say that school choice would probably be the number one bill that I would hope to pass, but there's about 50 things that I want to do, to be quite honest with you.
It's not a fair question.
The school choice thing, that would help so many families. We're ranked as dead last in the nation in terms of education freedom. So I hope my hands are on the school choice bill as much as possible.
Is there anything else you'd like voters to know, or how can they support Brandon in his reelection campaign?
Well, absolutely. By the way, I think it's John Burke is my favorite North Dakota historical figure, the guy that's right outside the Capitol. Anyway, we have two monuments in D.C., and that's Burke and Sakakawea. And
Okay.
I've always liked Burke. He's a Democrat, though, by the way.
Okay.
Anyway, what I would say is that I have a website, www.prichardnd.com. That would be a really good way of seeing what my platform is a little bit more. I have my phone number and my contact information on there if you'd like to get involved. Feel free to contact me. I'd really like to get you involved in my campaign and what we're doing here in District 8 to keep North Dakota conservative and to move the Republican Party forward.
Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate you joining us today. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. This has been another episode of the Dakotans Election Central, where we are comprehensively covering the 2024 North Dakota election cycle. I'm Jonathan Starr. Be sure to go to mydakotan.com, click Election Central. There you'll see a database of all the candidates that are running for election this year. You'll be able to see other videos just like the one you watched, read articles, be in the know for the 2024 election cycle. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, like and subscribe on YouTube, become part of the Dakotan community. Thank you and have a great day.